She was not merely rejected. She was humiliated before 500 of England's most powerful witnesses by the very Duke she had given 7 years of her life to, on what was supposed to be their wedding day. Broken and alone, she walked away from the altar with nothing but her dignity. But dignity, it turns out, is exactly the kind of thing that draws a certain kind of man. And when she returned to society, standing at the side of someone entirely unexpected, the Duke, who had discarded her, felt something he had not anticipated. Regret has a particular look on a man who has never worn it before. Camille Kensington never imagined that the greatest love of her life would begin in the ruins of the worst day she had ever lived. The morning of October the 14th, 1852, arrived like a painting no artist had dared to finish. Fog rolled across the grounds of Thornwick Hall in slow, heavy waves, curling around the stone columns and swallowing the lower hedgerows whole. The oak trees along the long gravel drive stood dark and leafless against a sky that had not yet decided whether to offer light or withhold it. Somewhere beyond the mist, the bells of St. Bartholomew Chapel had already begun their low, resonant tolling, the sound deep enough to feel in the chest, steady enough to count breaths by. Inside Thornwick Hall, no one was still. Servants moved through every corridor with the controlled urgency of people who understood the weight of the day. Footmen carried towering arrangements of white roses and French lilies, their arms trembling with the effort. Maids pressed wrinkles from silk table runners with irons that released small clouds of steam. A jeweller had arrived at dawn to verify the condition of 3 pieces of Kensington heirloom jewellery. 2 tailors waited in the antechamber with their needles threaded, ready for any final adjustment required. 500 invitations had gone out. 500 of England's most powerful, most titled, most watchful individuals were expected to fill the pews of St. Bartholomew by noon. The Morning Post had already named it, in bold black letters above the society column, the wedding of the decade. And at the very centre of all of it, at the quiet, still, breathless centre, stood Camille Kensington. She was 24 years old, and she was not trembling. That was the first thing one noticed about Camille. Not her beauty, though that was present, the clean line of her jaw, the dark sweep of her lashes, the slender neck that her mother had always called her best feature. What one noticed first was her stillness, the quality of her composure, the way she stood before the long, gilded mirror in her chamber, as though she were something carved rather than something living, held in perfect control by a discipline she had spent 7 years perfecting. Her bridal gown was ivory silk, its bodice fitted with a precision that spoke of months of work. The skirts fell in layers, each one a shade warmer than the last, so that the whole effect shimmered faintly when she moved, like cream catching a candle's edge. Her dark hair had been swept and pinned by her lady's maid with architecture that rivaled any structure in London. Small pearls were threaded through it. Her gloves were already on. White silk to the elbow, smooth and unblemished. She looked, by every measurable standard, like exactly what this day required. Her mother, Lady Clara Kensington, stood behind her reflected in the glass. Clara was a woman of 50 who had never entirely forgiven time for what it had done to her cheekbones, but she dressed magnificently and held herself with the iron posture of someone who had always understood that appearance was its own form of power. "You look precisely as a duchess should look," her mother said. "Hold your chin a fraction higher." "Not too much." "That much," Camille adjusted. Not because she disagreed, not because she agreed, simply because adjusting cost nothing, and disagreeing would cost the next 20 minutes. Her attention was not on her mother. Her attention was on her wrist, specifically on the bracelet that encircled it, a slim chain of gold, set with 5 sapphires, each stone the exact blue of a late summer sky. Alexander had sent it from Vienna 4 years into his absence, wrapped in brown paper and accompanied by a letter written in his confident, slightly sprawling hand. These are the colour of the sky over the Alps, when the light falls correctly at evening. I find myself thinking, when I see it, that the sky has not been the same colour since I left England. I am enclosing this so that you will know, wherever I am, the colour of the sky reminds me of you. She could still recall the precise sensation of opening that package, the way her fingers had worked at the string, the way the bracelet had caught the morning light from her bedroom window and scattered small blue points across the ceiling. She had worn it every day since. 7 years. 7 years of letters. 7 years of waiting. 7 years of turning away every man who had attempted to approach her family with a proposal, because she had been promised. Not publicly. The formal announcement had been reserved for Alexander's return, but the promise existed, and it was as real to Camille as any document her father had signed. Their fathers had agreed upon it. The Kensington estate and the Ravenshire fortune had been quietly aligned in anticipation of it. Society knew without being told, the way society always knew things without being told. Camille Kensington was spoken for, and Alexander Sterling, 7th Duke of Ravenshire, was coming home to claim her. She thought now of the last time she had seen him. October 1845. She had been 17, and he had been 22, and they had stood beneath the oak tree at the far end of the east garden, while his carriage waited on the drive. He had been tall even then, with the particular kind of handsomeness that came from good bone structure rather than effort. Dark eyes, a straight nose, a way of standing that suggested he was accustomed to rooms turning toward him. He had taken her hand. He had held it, properly, formally, in his gloved one. And he had said, "I will return, Camille. You have my word." That was all. No declaration of love, no poetic speech. He was 22 and pressed for time, and not, she had understood even then, a man who arranged his feelings into sentences easily. But his eyes had held hers long enough that she had believed him. The sincerity in them had been unmistakable. The intention had been real. She had believed him for 7 years. He had returned 8 months ago, 30 years old now, broader in the shoulder, darker in the eye, carrying about him the particular gravity of a man who has spent years in rooms where the wrong word could start a war. Society had welcomed him back with embarrassing enthusiasm. Every hostess in London had wanted him at her table. Every newspaper had printed his portrait. He was celebrated, admired, powerful in ways that exceeded even what his title already granted him. He had called on the Kensington house within a fortnight of his return. He had been courteous, measured, perfectly appropriate. He had not been warm. Camille had told herself it was the adjustment. He had been abroad for 7 years. He was relearning England. He was tired. Men returned from long service, carrying things they were not yet ready to set down. She had told herself all of this, patiently and thoroughly, the way she told herself most things that required patience and thoroughness. 6 months of courtship, formal, correct, observed by society, had passed, and now here she was, on the morning of October the 14th, in ivory silk with sapphires on her wrist, ready to become his duchess. The door to her chamber opened. Mabel came in. Camille watched her sister's reflection enter the glass. Mabel Kensington was 20 years old, and the world had always found her easier to look at than Camille. Brighter, softer, the kind of beauty that asks nothing difficult of the observer. Her hair was lighter. Her laugh was quicker. She had none of Camille's discipline, and none of her depth, and these absences read, to most of society, as virtues. People called Mabel charming. People called Camille admirable, which was the word they used when they did not know what else to say. Mabel was dressed for the wedding in pale cornflower blue. The colour should have been understated. Instead, on Mabel, it glowed. "You look beautiful," Mabel said. Her voice was soft, perfectly calibrated. Camille turned from the mirror to look at her directly, and in that moment, in the space between one breath and the next, she noticed something that she could not immediately name. Something in the brightness of Mabel's eyes. Something in the particular quality of her smile. It was not happiness exactly, or rather it was happiness that had been present longer than this morning. It was the happiness of someone who had been holding a secret with both hands and was now very close to setting it down. "Thank you," Camille said. Mabel crossed the room and adjusted one of Camille's pearl pins with a light, sisterly touch. Her fingers were steady, completely steady. Why are her hands so steady? Camille's mind moved quietly over the question. She is always nervous in large gatherings. She cried at Margaret Ashford's wedding from pure excitement. Why are her hands so steady today? She filed it away. There was no time, and the observation was small, and surely it was nothing. Her mother called for them both. The carriages were ready. St. Bartholomew Chapel was full to its last pew. The building was old, 14th century stone, grey and immovable, its windows fitted with deep-coloured glass that painted the interior in shifting jewel tones when the sun moved. Today the sun was cautious, offering itself in thin lines through the fog, but enough light reached the interior to set the gold fixtures gleaming, and to make the 24 candelabras along the aisle burn cleanly without competition. Camille sat in the antechamber and listened to the organ. The music was dignified and correct, and utterly impersonal, the way all chapel music was, and she had nothing to do with her hands except hold her bouquet, white roses and trailing ivy, and breathe. She heard the murmur of 500 voices settling. She heard the precise moment when Alexander entered from the side door and took his place at the altar, because the murmur dropped, briefly, into near silence, then rose again with a different texture. The text of appreciation for a man whom society considered its greatest eligible prize, now finally, publicly, officially taking his place. Her father came to stand beside her. Lord William Kensington was 61 years old, and had the permanently strained expression of a man who had spent 4 decades managing a family estate that had always cost slightly more than it produced. This marriage, this alliance, was the resolution of a problem he had been carrying for 15 years. He did not look at Camille's face. He looked at the chapel door. "Head up," he said. "Walk steadily. Do not look at the guests." "Yes, father." The door opened. 500 pairs of eyes turned. Camille walked. She had imagined this moment so many times over 7 years that she expected, when it arrived, to feel the weight of all those imagined versions pressing down on the real one. Instead, she felt something quieter, something almost like clarity. The aisle was long, and the candles burned, and the roses in her arms were cold from the morning chill, and her dress made a soft sound against the stone floor with each step. She kept her eyes on the altar. She kept them on Alexander. He was, in the morning light filtering through the chapel's coloured glass, everything he had always been and more. The years had added something, not age exactly, but consequence. He stood straight and composed in his dark coat, his hands clasped at his back, and as she walked toward him, Camille thought, with a feeling so familiar it barely registered, "This is the man I have been waiting for." She was 20 feet away when she noticed it. He was not meeting her eyes. He was looking at her, at the general direction of her, but not at her eyes. His gaze kept shifting, just slightly, just fractionally, in the way that a person's gaze shifts when they cannot bear to land directly on what they are looking at. 10 feet. His jaw was set. She had seen that particular set of his jaw once before, during a difficult conversation about estate finances, when he had been resolving himself to say something unpleasant.